It was a cold Tuesday afternoon when Mr. Lewis pushed open the door of the little diner on Main Street. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered, the sound barely breaking the quiet of the early lunch hour. The warmth of the diner hit him immediately, a welcome escape from the biting chill outside. He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. The air was thick with the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon. Mr. Lewis wasn't much to look at. His jacket was worn, with patches on the elbows, and the knees of his trousers were frayed from years of use. His shoes, though polished, had seen better days. His hair, gray and thin, was combed neatly, but there was something in his posture, the way he moved slowly but with purpose, that made it clear he wasn't someone anyone would notice at first glance. Behind the counter, Mandy, the waitress, didn't look up from the stack of dishes she was drying. She was busy, her mind already lost in the rhythm of her work. She had seen dozens of customers like him before. Old men who shuffled in out of the cold, looking for a hot meal, a cup of coffee, maybe a slice of pie. They came in, they ate, and they left nothing special about it. Nothing worth noting. The diner had been open for years, a fixture on Main Street, serving up homey meals to locals who had long since stopped caring much about the quality of the food. It was just there. It was a place where people went when they needed a quick bite, or when they were too tired to cook at home. And the wait staff? Well, they were just there to do their jobs, collect their tips, and go home. No one ever expected much more. So when Mr. Lewis sat at a table near the window, Mandy didn't even blink. She just wiped her hands on her apron and grabbed a pad of paper. Without looking up, she asked in her usual, bored tone, "What can I get ya?" Mr. Lewis smiled softly, his voice warm as he spoke. "Just a coffee, please." Mandy nodded and turned to walk away. She had already moved on to the next thought in her mind, her attention already slipping to the noise in the kitchen. The cook was behind, as usual, and she had orders piling up. This man, whoever he was, wouldn't be any different from the others. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that this man wasn't just another old man sitting in her diner, ordering a coffee. No, Mr. Lewis was different. And this diner, with its cracked tiles and faded booths, would soon find itself at the center of something that no one in this sleepy little town could have ever imagined. It wasn't that Mr. Lewis was someone extraordinary in the way that people usually think of extraordinary. He wasn't a famous celebrity, a powerful businessman, or a wealthy philanthropist. In fact, he looked like just the opposite, a man who had lived a quiet, simple life, with little more than the clothes on his back and the slow shuffle of his feet to show for it. But Mr. Lewis had something that Mandy couldn't see, not yet. He was a man who knew how to wait. He knew that timing was everything, and that sometimes, the right moment came when you least expected it. It wasn't about rushing through life, or pushing to get what you wanted. No, Mr. Lewis understood the power of patience, of letting things unfold in their own time. And today, as he sat quietly at that table in the diner, he was waiting for the right moment. Mandy, on the other hand, was too focused on the clock. The lunch rush was coming, and she could already hear the distant hum of cars parking outside. She had more important things to worry about than the quiet old man in the corner. There was the young couple in the booth behind him who had been chatting non-stop for the last half hour. They had left a decent tip, but they were taking up valuable space. And then there was the businesswoman sitting by the door, typing away on her laptop, pretending not to notice when she spilled her coffee on her papers. "Coffee coming right up," Mandy called out, as she poured a cup for the woman at the counter, never once glancing at Mr. Lewis. As the minutes ticked by, Mr. Lewis sat still, his fingers gently tapping on the table. His eyes were soft but alert, taking in every detail of the diner. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft clink of silverware being placed on the table, the smell of eggs sizzling on the stove. It was all so familiar, so comforting, and yet, somehow, out of place. This place, this little diner, it was the heart of this town, but it was also stuck. Stuck in the past, stuck in a routine that no one seemed to question. And Mr. Lewis, though he seemed so ordinary, was about to change that. But not yet. Not now. Mandy didn't know it, but today would be the last day she ever looked at a customer the way she had looked at Mr. Lewis. It would be the last time she dismissed someone based on their appearance or their age. She didn't see it now, but Mr. Lewis wasn't just another lonely old man with nowhere else to go. He was someone who understood the value of patience, who knew the importance of waiting for the right moment. And right now, he was simply waiting for the moment to arrive. The door opened again, and a few more customers walked in, laughing and chatting. Mandy turned away, distracted. But Mr. Lewis smiled to himself. He had all the time in the world. Mandy was already feeling the weight of the day. She'd woken up late, as usual, and had barely made it to the diner before the morning rush started. Her boss, Mr. Harper, had scolded her when she walked in, his face a mixture of annoyance and disappointment. He didn't care if she'd had a rough night. He didn't care about the traffic or the rain. All he cared about was that she was late, and that was enough to make his frustration bubble over. Late again, Mandy. You know better than that, he had snapped at her when she stepped through the door. Mandy had bit her lip and nodded, trying to keep the irritation from spilling out. She didn't have the energy to argue with him. It wasn't worth it. Her tips had been lousy too. She had tried her best, smiling and being polite, but the customers could sense her mood. A few of them left just a couple of dollars after their meal, leaving her frustrated and annoyed. The regulars came in, expecting the same service they always got, but none of them seemed to understand that her patience was wearing thin. It felt like she was invisible, her efforts ignored, no matter how much she tried to please. And the new guy, he had been staring at her ever since he walked in. She wasn't sure if it was because he noticed she was struggling or if he was just another one of those men who thought they could get whatever they wanted. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. Mandy wasn't in the mood to deal with him. Her eyes darted across the room as she wiped down the counter. A few regulars were finishing up their meals, chatting loudly, while a couple of younger folks sat at the back booth, snickering and taking selfies. It was all so noisy, so messy. She could feel the exhaustion setting in as the minutes passed. Then she saw him. Mr. Lewis, the old man who had just walked in and sat at the window seat. She couldn't help but sigh as she watched him. The way he walked, slow and deliberate, with the kind of shuffle only old men seemed to have. The jacket he wore looked like it had seen better days, patched up in places where the fabric had worn thin. He looked out of place in this diner. This wasn't the kind of place for people like him. The young people in the booth probably didn't even notice him. They were too busy taking selfies, laughing at their phones. The businessmen who came in for lunch wouldn't care either. They'd be too focused on their meetings or their sandwiches to notice a man like Mr. Lewis sitting quietly at the corner table. Mandy shook her head, letting out another long sigh. The last thing she needed was another old man sitting around, wasting time. She had work to do. She had customers to take care of. Still, there he was. She walked over to him with her usual hurried step, trying to get it over with. She'd already made up her mind that she wouldn't be polite. She wouldn't smile like she usually did. She'd just get the order, bring the coffee, and move on. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice sharp, barely hiding the annoyance she felt. Mr. Lewis looked up at her, his eyes soft, warm even, despite the weariness of his years. There was a gentle smile on his face, though it didn't reach his eyes. He looked like someone who had seen a lot of things, someone who had lived through hardships but hadn't let them harden his heart. "Just a coffee, please," he said quietly. Mandy barely heard him. She was already halfway to the counter, ready to grab the pot of coffee. She rolled her eyes as she turned away, muttering under her breath. Figures. Barely worth the effort, she said, loud enough that he might hear her. It wasn't that she meant to be rude, but she had had enough. She had had enough of people expecting her to be cheery, to smile all the time. She was tired. The work was tiring. And today, she wasn't in the mood to pretend like everything was fine. But when she turned back toward the counter, she couldn't help but notice Mr. Lewis sitting there, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He wasn't watching her, he wasn't judging her, but there was something about him that made her feel uncomfortable. Mandy took the coffee pot, refilled a couple of cups at the counter, and tried to keep herself busy. But every time she glanced at Mr. Lewis, she felt that uncomfortable feeling grow. She wasn't sure what it was. It wasn't like he was glaring at her. It wasn't like he was being rude. He was just sitting there, waiting. And that waiting, it bothered her. Why didn't he just order, eat, and leave like everyone else? Why did he have to sit there, staring out the window like he was expecting something? She wasn't sure how much time passed, but when she looked up again, he was still sitting there. His cup was empty now, but he hadn't moved. The lunch rush had started. More people were walking in, the sound of the bell above the door jingling each time. She had customers to tend to, but her attention kept drifting back to him. "Are you going to just sit there all day?" she muttered under her breath. But no one was listening. The other customers were talking, laughing, chatting about their work or their plans for the evening. The clatter of dishes and the hum of conversations filled the air, and yet Mr. Lewis sat in silence, as if he didn't care about the noise. Mandy shook her head again, trying to push away the feeling of unease. He wasn't bothering anyone. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just waiting. But she couldn't shake it. There was something off about it. She had seen people come and go in this diner, but no one ever sat like that. No one ever sat there, still and quiet, just waiting for something. And yet, for some reason, Mr. Lewis didn't seem to be in any hurry. He didn't seem to mind the noise, the busyness, or the way everyone else was rushing around. He seemed perfectly content to sit there, in his worn jacket, just watching the world go by. The hours dragged on, and the afternoon seemed to stretch longer than usual. The quiet clink of coffee cups, the sound of footsteps echoing against the floor, and the hum of distant conversations filled the diner, but in Mr. Lewis's corner, time moved at its own pace. He sat there, quietly sipping his coffee, occasionally glancing out the window as if watching something that no one else could see. Mandy couldn't help but notice him. It wasn't that he was doing anything special. In fact, it was his stillness, his calmness, that seemed to bother her the most. He wasn't fidgeting or checking his watch, like most of the other customers. He didn't even seem to care that the diner was filling up with people, the chatter growing louder with each passing minute. He just sat there, observing. She walked past him again, her eyes narrowing as she refilled the coffee cups of other customers. As she passed, she whispered to her co-worker, Laura, who was wiping down a nearby table. "Doesn't he have somewhere to be?" she muttered. Laura looked over her shoulder, noticing Mr. Lewis for the first time. "Huh. Who knows? Some people just come in here to pass the time, I guess." But Mandy's patience was running out. "It's almost closing time, and he's still here. Doesn't he have a life?" she asked, her words sharper than she intended. Laura shrugged. "Maybe he likes the coffee." Mandy didn't respond. She was too busy with the rest of the customers who were making their demands. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Lewis. Why was he still here? Why hadn't he left like everyone else? What was it about him that seemed so out of place? She tried to ignore the thoughts, to focus on the plates of food that needed delivering and the drinks that needed refilling. But every time she passed by Mr. Lewis's table, she felt a little more frustrated. It was like he was just sitting there, watching her, waiting for something. But what? Despite her growing irritation, Mr. Lewis remained unfazed. He thanked her each time she refilled his coffee, his voice calm, polite, and warm. "Thank you," he'd say, his smile genuine but never too eager. But Mandy's responses grew shorter and colder with each exchange. "You're welcome," she'd mutter, barely meeting his gaze. She wanted him to leave. She wanted the quiet, predictable routine of the diner back. But Mr. Lewis didn't leave. Instead, he continued sitting in his corner, patiently waiting, observing. Mandy couldn't understand why he seemed so calm, so unbothered by everything around him. Was he really that comfortable, or was there something else happening beneath the surface? As the clock ticked toward the late afternoon, the diner began to slow down. A few customers lingered, chatting with each other, while others finished their meals and got up to leave. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor and the door jingling with each entry and exit seemed almost exaggerated in the quiet of the diner. But through it all, Mr. Lewis remained in his corner, his hands folded, his eyes slowly scanning the room. And what Mandy didn't realize was that Mr. Lewis wasn't just sitting there. He was watching everything. He noticed the peeling paint on the walls, the cracks in the floorboards, the wear on the seats. The diner, it seemed, was in need of care. It was like it had been forgotten, left behind in time. The once vibrant colors of the walls were now faded and chipped, the booths worn and cracked from years of use. It was as though the diner was losing its life, its energy, piece by piece. He saw how tired the staff looked, the way Mandy's shoulders drooped as she moved from table to table, her eyes darting nervously as if she wanted to escape. She didn't smile anymore. She didn't have the energy to make small talk or offer the warm, friendly service that had once been her trademark. The exhaustion was in her posture, in the way she moved, in the way she avoided eye contact with her customers. And the customers, he watched them too. They seemed to shuffle in and out, eating their meals without much joy or enthusiasm. There was no laughter, no connection. They came in, ate, and left like clockwork. They didn't talk to one another. They didn't seem to be enjoying themselves. It was almost as if they were all on autopilot, going through the motions of life without really living it. Mr. Lewis noticed it all. The quiet despair, the lack of energy, the sense of something lost. And he wondered, when had things changed? When had the diner, this place that had once been full of life and laughter, become just another stop on the daily routine, a place to grab a quick meal before heading back to the grind? When had it stopped being a place of warmth, of connection? As he sat there, taking it all in, he realized something. He wasn't just observing the diner. He was observing life itself. The way people came and went, the way things faded over time, unnoticed by most. And he began to understand why he was here. He had been brought to this place for a reason. But Mr. Lewis wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't rushing. He was patient, and he knew that everything had its time. Mandy, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated. Every time she walked past him, she could feel the weight of his gaze on her. She didn't know what it was, but something about him unsettled her. She wanted him to leave. She wanted him to just order his coffee, pay, and go. But Mr. Lewis didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He was simply there. At one point, as she walked past him again, she couldn't help but snap, "You've been here for hours. Are you planning on ordering anything else?" Mr. Lewis looked up at her, his expression calm and unreadable. "No, thank you. Just the coffee is fine." His tone was gentle, but there was something in it that made Mandy pause. There was no anger, no frustration. Just understanding. Like he knew exactly what she was thinking, but didn't feel the need to respond to it. It caught her off guard, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of something like guilt. But she quickly shook it off. He was just an old man, after all. Just another customer. She didn't have time to feel guilty. But deep down, a small part of her wondered, why did he choose to stay here, in this place? Why was he so calm when everything around him seemed to be falling apart? The answer was still beyond her reach, but Mr. Lewis wasn't in a hurry to share it. Not yet. The morning sunlight had barely begun to filter through the dusty windows of the diner when an unusual hum filled the air. For the first time in a long while, there was an energy in the diner that felt different. It wasn't the usual lazy pace, the steady clinking of coffee cups, or the quiet hum of background chatter. No, this was something that had been missing for a long time. Mandy was busy wiping down the counter, feeling the ache in her shoulders from hours of work the day before. The day was already shaping up to be like any other ordinary, quiet, and uneventful. But then something unexpected happened. A low rumble filled the street outside. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable beneath the usual sounds of morning traffic. But it grew louder, and soon, the unmistakable purr of expensive cars could be heard as they pulled up to the curb. The engine sounds grew closer, and with it came the strange tension that buzzed in the air. Mandy glanced out the window, frowning at the sight of sleek black cars far too shiny, far too polished for a place like this. She blinked and shook her head, trying to ignore it, but curiosity tugged at her. She walked back to her station behind the counter and stood still for a moment, watching as the doors of the cars opened, one by one. Out stepped sharply dressed individuals, their shoes clicking on the pavement, the fabric of their suits pressed perfectly, each of them walking with a distinct air of confidence. Their steps were purposeful, their movements sharp and businesslike. It was the kind of scene Mandy wasn't used to. It wasn't just a group of people, these were professionals. The kind of people who belonged in high-rise offices, not in this quiet, sleepy diner. But at the center of the group stood someone she knew. It was him. Mr. Lewis. Mandy's stomach dropped as her gaze locked onto him. She knew it was him, but something was different. He was standing tall, walking confidently, his posture straight and proud, no longer hunched over as he had been the day before. He was no longer the man in the old, worn jacket with the slow shuffle. This man was someone else entirely. Mr. Lewis was wearing a tailored suit, dark and sophisticated. The wrinkles of his old jacket were gone, replaced with the sharp, crisp lines of a well-fitted blazer. His hair, once a little messy and unkempt, was neatly combed back. There was something about the way he moved now, a certain authority in his every step. Mandy's eyes widened, her hand gripping the cloth so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She stood frozen, unsure whether to believe what she was seeing. This couldn't be the same man. This wasn't the quiet, elderly man who had sat in her diner, sipping coffee without a care in the world. This was someone who commanded attention, someone who belonged in a world far beyond this little diner. As he approached the door, the other staff members, too, stopped what they were doing. The noise in the diner seemed to quiet down, as if the building itself was holding its breath. And when Mr. Lewis stepped through the door, the group of sharply dressed individuals following him, Mandy felt the weight of the moment. The door jingled as it opened, and every eye in the diner turned toward him. "Good morning," Mr. Lewis said, his voice warm, but powerful. He smiled politely at the staff, as if he hadn't noticed the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. "I'm here to meet the staff." Mandy felt as though the air had been knocked out of her. She stood there, mouth slightly open, staring at him as though he had just appeared out of thin air. The man who had sat quietly, sipping coffee for hours, was now the center of attention. The man who had been ignored, dismissed even, was now here standing tall, radiating a calm authority that sent shivers down her spine. Her gaze flicked to the owner of the diner, who had rushed from the back, his face pale and his movements hurried. He looked flustered, disoriented even. The flurry of activity in the diner had clearly unsettled him. "Mmr Lewis," the owner stammered, his voice trembling. "I didn't expect you so early." His words hung in the air, and Mandy's mind raced to catch up with what was happening. Her brain was struggling to process the change that had taken place right in front of her. The owner turned to face her, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and fear. Mandy, he cleared his throat nervously. "Meet our new owner." The words felt like a punch to Mandy's gut. He what?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Our new owner," the owner repeated, nodding frantically. "He just bought the place. He's the one who. The owner was clearly struggling to find the words, his nervous energy palpable. He looked back at Mr. Lewis as though seeking reassurance, and when he turned back to Mandy, his face was a mixture of confusion and discomfort. Mandy blinked, her mouth going dry. She couldn't process it. This man, this Mr. Lewis, the one she had served yesterday as though he were just another customer, was now the owner of the diner. The same diner she had worked at for so long. The same diner that had been her life, her only source of income, and where she had thought she would stay for years to come. But now, everything had changed. Mandy didn't know what to say. She looked at Mr. Lewis again, trying to find something familiar about him, but all she saw was a stranger. A stranger who had somehow come into her world, into her life, and turned everything upside down. But there was more to this than just the shock of his appearance. There was a deeper understanding that began to settle in her chest. Something about Mr. Lewis, something about the way he had observed everything the day before, about the way he had seen the diner's decline, it all started to make sense. This wasn't just a random visit. This wasn't just a man looking for a cup of coffee. This was intentional. This was calculated. And now, he was here, ready to take control. As the staff quietly murmured amongst themselves, unsure of what to do, Mr. Lewis remained calm, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His eyes swept over the room, taking in the faces of the staff and the surroundings. He didn't speak right away, but his presence was enough. Everyone in the room could feel the shift. Mandy watched as Mr. Lewis walked toward the counter, his every step purposeful, confident. He reached the owner, who was still standing there, frozen in place, and gave him a polite nod. The man's hands trembled as he gestured toward the kitchen. "Shall we?" Mr. Lewis asked. The owner, barely able to keep up, nodded vigorously. "Of course, Mr. Lewis. Right this way." And with that, the new owner of the diner, Mr. Lewis, turned and followed the owner to the back. Mandy stood there, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. The quiet man from yesterday was now the man who held the keys to everything. The diner was no longer the same. The moment Mr. Lewis made his announcement, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. It was as if the entire room had been struck by a sudden wave of realization. The air, thick with disbelief, held a strange tension as each person tried to process what had just happened. Mandy felt the weight of the moment press down on her chest. She tried to swallow, but her throat felt dry, tight. Her face burned with embarrassment, a deep crimson spreading across her cheeks. The man she had treated with such coldness, the one she had barely spared a glance, was now the owner of the very place she worked. Her paycheck, her job, her future, they all now rested in his hands. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at her shoes, unable to look up. The realization was a cold, harsh slap. She had dismissed Mr. Lewis, mocked him, thought of him as just another old man. She had never bothered to understand who he was or what he might be capable of. Now, that same man had turned her world upside down in a single moment. It wasn't just the shock of his sudden ownership that hit her. It was the deep, bitter taste of her own arrogance. She had judged him, dismissed him, as if her small, narrow world was the only one that mattered. Now, in the blink of an eye, everything had changed. Mr. Lewis stood there, a quiet presence in the room. His smile was soft, but there was a firmness to it that made the hairs on Mandy's neck stand up. It wasn't a smile of kindness, it was a smile of understanding, of quiet authority. "Mandy," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight, "let's have a chat later about customer service. It's going to be a priority moving forward." His words were not harsh, but they stung. Mandy could feel the judgment in his tone, the clear message that her behavior had not gone unnoticed. And it wasn't just her, she could sense the weight of his expectations on everyone. Mr. Lewis wasn't going to allow this diner to continue in its current state. He wasn't going to allow any of them to rest on their laurels or waste another day coasting through their jobs. For the first time, Mandy wondered whether he had been watching her all along, studying the way she treated the customers, the way she slacked off when no one was looking. Had he seen it all? Had he been waiting for the right moment to reveal who he really was? As Mr. Lewis turned to address the rest of the staff, his voice carried throughout the diner. "I see potential in this place," he said, his eyes scanning the room, making sure each employee felt his gaze. "With a little care and respect, we'll make it something special." His words were not empty. They were not just hopeful platitudes. There was a certainty to them, a clear vision that Mandy couldn't deny. She had been here for years, but Mr. Lewis, with his quiet authority, seemed to see something in the diner that she had long since forgotten. Something important. Something worth saving. He paused for a moment, and the room fell into an almost reverent silence. "We're going to make this diner a place people want to come to. A place where they feel welcome. Where they feel valued." His voice was steady, but it rang with a sense of purpose that couldn't be ignored. Mandy couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had seen the customers leave the diner every day with tired faces, in a rush, not lingering over their meals. She had seen how little care was given to the food, to the service, to the atmosphere. But now, everything felt different. Mr. Lewis wasn't here to let that slide. He wasn't here to tolerate mediocrity. He was here to make a change. And that change, it seemed, was going to start with her. As Mr. Lewis turned to head toward the back office, the room seemed to breathe again. The buzz of whispers filled the air, but it was not just the staff talking amongst themselves. It was the air of shock, of disbelief, of realization setting in. The diners were still there, watching with curious eyes. The staff exchanged glances, some of them uncertain, others wide-eyed, as if they weren't quite sure what they had just witnessed. Mandy, though, was frozen in place. She felt the weight of the room press down on her. She couldn't bear to look up, to meet anyone's eyes. How could she? How could she face anyone after the way she had treated Mr. Lewis? She couldn't erase the past, the rude comments, the mocking glances, the impatience she had shown. It was all out there now, clear as day. And now, here she was, standing in the very diner she had so carelessly taken for granted, about to face the consequences of her actions. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. A subtle, almost imperceptible change swept over Mandy. She felt a shift inside her, a twinge of realization that perhaps, just perhaps, this was the wake-up call she needed. For the first time, she wondered whether she had been looking at everything the wrong way. Maybe she hadn't been as confident in her place in the world as she thought. Maybe she wasn't as untouchable as she had assumed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the owner, who had followed Mr. Lewis to the back office. He turned briefly, his eyes darting nervously between the staff and the front door. He cleared his throat awkwardly before addressing the room. "Well, I'm sure we all have work to do," he said, his voice strained. "Let's get back to it." But the energy in the diner had shifted. The casual chatter that once filled the space seemed more uncertain now, as if everyone was still trying to process what had just happened. Mandy stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to shake the feeling that everything around her had changed. And in a way, it had. As the morning wore on, the diner seemed to come alive in a way it hadn't in years. There was a new energy, a new purpose, in the air. People worked harder, more focused. They cleaned the tables with more care, served with more patience. It was as if Mr. Lewis had lit a fire under them, made them see the potential in what they had been taking for granted. But Mandy couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. She knew that things were going to change. She knew that she was going to have to change. And in a strange way, she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Later that afternoon, Mr. Lewis called her into the back office. The room was quiet, the air thick with tension. She entered, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't remember the last time she had been so nervous. "Mandy," he began, his voice calm, but still firm. "We need to talk about how we can improve this place." Mandy nodded, though she felt as if the words were stuck in her throat. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to beg for another chance. But all she could do was nod and listen, as Mr. Lewis laid out his vision for the diner. A vision where respect, care, and customer service would be at the forefront. It was a conversation that would change everything for her. And perhaps, just perhaps, it would be the beginning of a change she had long needed. The days that followed were filled with quiet but significant change. In the weeks after Mr. Lewis's arrival at the diner, Mandy found herself looking at everything differently. It wasn't just the diner itself that was changing, it was the way she saw the world, the people in it, and her own role in all of it. For the first time in a long while, she found herself thinking more about others, about their feelings, their stories, and their lives. She wasn't just serving coffee anymore, she was learning to serve people, to listen to them, to understand them. There were days when she still caught herself slipping back into old habits, but now, there was something inside her that nudged her to do better, to be better. She remembered the day Mr. Lewis had taken the time to sit down with her, even after the mistakes she had made. He didn't scold her or belittle her, instead, he shared his vision for the diner, for the future. He believed in potential, in the power of second chances. His kindness was like a small spark that had ignited something deep inside her, a spark she hadn't known existed until that moment. Mandy learned that the people we sometimes overlook, the ones we think are insignificant, are often the ones paying the closest attention. They see more than we realize. They notice the small things, the details that slip past us in our rush to move forward. And sometimes, it's those people who have the wisdom to teach us the biggest lessons. Mr. Lewis had been watching all along. He had seen the way Mandy treated the customers, the way the staff was burned out and unmotivated, and how the diner itself had slowly fallen into disrepair. But instead of pointing fingers or letting it all go, he chose to step in with kindness and patience. He chose to invest in people like Mandy, who might have been lost to their own bitterness if given the chance. He didn't just buy the diner. He bought the possibility of change. And change came slowly, but it came. The staff began to feel a sense of pride in their work. The customers noticed the difference too. The diner had become a place that was warm, inviting, and full of life. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And better, as Mr. Lewis had shown, was always worth striving for. For Mandy, the lesson was clear: every act of kindness, no matter how small, could plant a seed for change. Every word, every gesture, carried weight. And every action, whether it was one of kindness or cruelty, would eventually come full circle, finding its way back to you. She couldn't change the past, she couldn't undo the way she had treated Mr. Lewis that first day. But she could change the present. She could choose to be better, to show kindness where there had been none, to make the diner a place where everyone felt welcome, not just the paying customers but the people who worked there too. As for Mr. Lewis, the lessons were different for him. For him, it was never about the diner. It was never about the coffee, the menu, or the staff. It was about the people, the quiet, overlooked people who needed someone to believe in them. He had spent his life quietly observing, learning, and waiting for the right moment to make a difference. And when that moment came, he didn't hesitate. He didn't show off or demand attention. He simply took action and let the results speak for themselves. Mr. Lewis had spent his life finding ways to help others. He had given countless chances to people who had nowhere else to turn. And each time, he saw the transformation, the potential rise to the surface in ways no one could predict. He knew that the smallest acts could lead to the biggest changes. For Mr. Lewis, the diner was just the beginning. He knew that there were other places, other people, who needed a second chance, who needed a little kindness, who needed to know that someone was watching, waiting, and willing to help them grow. The diner had become a symbol of that philosophy, a place where people were not judged by their mistakes, but by the potential they carried inside them. Mandy had learned that, and now, so had the rest of the staff. They were starting to see each other, really see each other, as individuals, not just co-workers or customers. They were part of something bigger than themselves, a team that cared for one another. And as for the customers, they could feel the difference too. There was something about the atmosphere that had shifted, a warmth, an energy, a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. The diner wasn't just a place to grab a quick bite anymore. It was a place where people came to feel seen, to feel valued. In a way, the diner had become a microcosm of the larger world. A world where everyone had something to offer, something worth sharing. A world where small acts of kindness could create ripple effects that spread far and wide, touching more lives than we could ever imagine. Mandy never forgot the lessons she learned from Mr. Lewis. She remembered the way he had looked at her that day, calm, steady, patient. She remembered how he had treated her not as someone who had messed up, but as someone who had the potential to do better. It had been a turning point in her life, a moment she would carry with her forever. And so, the diner continued to thrive, one cup of coffee at a time. Each day, each small action, brought the people inside it closer to the person they could become. Each act of kindness, each change in attitude, slowly transformed the space and the people within it. For Mandy, it was a new beginning. For Mr. Lewis, it was another chapter in a story that would never truly end. And as they both moved forward, they knew this much for sure: sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones watching the most closely. And every act of kindness or cruelty has a way of finding its way back, often in ways we least expect. In the end, kindness had been the thread that tied everything together, the force that had transformed a quiet diner into something more, a place where people found not just food, but also the chance to be seen, to be heard, and to make a difference in their own way. And for Mr. Lewis, that was always the point. It was never about owning a diner. It was about making a difference, one person, one act of kindness at a time.